this first session before, is it coffee after this or?
So, yeah, you've got two sessions. I mean, you can break for coffee in the middle, if you like, whatever.
Let's see how we go. Yeah. So this doesn't necessarily need to be long, but we have learned something, and it's kind of a living example, I suppose, or a recent example, a now example, which is great. So our launch Sunday, this is our first, in the latest version of Jubilee. We did used to have congregations all across the wider Cape Town area, way back when. They met in the morning, and then the larger meeting was in the evening at the Waverley Centre. That was all drawn back together into one. And so this is the first foray into what people are, as you know, calling multi-site church. This is our second site, so we've got two sites. There are two services here in Observatory and one in Clerve Street, in our Clerve Street building. So the launch Sunday was September 2016. The first proper Sunday was in October, you know, when you really kind of find out, okay, what's going on. We have had a number of advantages, so I don't want to give a wrong impression, but you'll see how we have been deliberately missional or evangelistic. Those are two different terms, and I'll define them and how they are different in just a second. But we've had a number of advantages over, for example, starting in, you know, like a school hall or something like that. The first advantage was the multi-site cushion in itself. So we weren't planting a brand new church. So again, you've got to recognize that in the story too. We had on paper at least 60 Jubilees, members of Jubilee, who said, we're with you. Two of which dropped out on the day we were sent out, which was really encouraging. And 30, again on paper, 30 Baptist church members. So this was a kind of collaboration between a Baptist church that was really in a tailspin and were in trouble, and we're gaining probably, or we're down to about 40, 50 on a good Sunday. But we're really hemorrhaging and basically said, can we do something together? And so that group came to this site in Observatory while all the renovations were taking place, and then we'd have meetings after, you know, coffee and tea and cake and meetings in this room to kind of get to know each other a little bit, speak into the vision. We did, Stephen Jack was my kind of guru on how to do this, so he just said what he'd done, and I just copied it basically. But one of the things he said, which I copied on steroids, was you've got to have like a vision night, you know, before you go in, maybe 6 months before, have a vision night. So what I turned that into was a prayer vision night once a month, leading right up. So every single month we were praying into it. Every Wednesday we were praying at lunchtime in the building while mayhem was all around us and builders were. And so there was a strong prayer focus all the way into doing it. It was wonderful because the main number, well, not the main number, but probably about 50% of the people who came to that Wednesday lunchtime prayer meeting were former Baptist members who've been praying that God would turn things around, praying that God would do something new. So it's very encouraging just to see that kind of overlap, which is, we were kind of joined or united in that overlap in prayer. So that was really very beautiful. Anyway, not all of the 30 Baptist guys stayed with us. So I was shooting for 120 and said it a few different times, but you probably only got 90 on paper or thereabouts. However, against the expectations of the research that we'd done before, and we talked with Kevin about, you know, all the various different churches like us in town. The second Sunday that we met, we just got about 90 freebies, at least. You know, we just suddenly, it was like 180 people, and it was like, wow, where did that come from? And there's a variety of people coming. There were a good number of hipsters, or at least Christians who looked like they'd been dipped in hipster juice and had been come out again. who were looking for something a bit more vague and maybe a bit more liberal. So even though they're dressing like 19th century colonialists, actually theologically what they're looking for was something that was far, far more liberal. We had some disgruntled types who weren't, who had bad experiences elsewhere and there were non-settling types who were just hopping around, and they've of course gone now as well. But we also received in that number a significant amount of healthy believers who, for whatever reason, have been waiting for, something like what we're doing in the city centre. And some of them are travelling in still from the suburbs and other places, and some of them are living in the city, have just been waiting. So we had a lot of advantages. We've tried to generate a healthy, sensible, but definite evangelistic awareness, reliable kind of quality of service that happens on the Sunday, and that attracts healthy Christians. I mean, a head screwed on, sensible but definite evangelistic impulse attracts healthy Christians, whether they're new in town, which we've had a lot of people moving in because that's the kind of nature of the place, or whether they've been in a holding pattern for a while waiting for something good in that particular area. The exterior of the building is of course unchanged, largely. We just painted the top strip, put a roof on. And several churches have failed, both in the same part of the city, in the Clove Street kind of area, but at least two have failed in that building itself. So the exterior of the building and the location by itself aren't necessarily winning points. However, the quality of what's happening, plus the quality of the work that we did inside the building, is like an immediate plus when people come in. They come into that space and it's neat, it's modern, it's not flashy, it's not weird, there's nothing like, we're not got shofars hanging up on the wall or weird scriptures that no one understands, whatever it is. There aren't weird scriptures, are there? What am I talking about? I don't know why I said that. Scripture on the wall wouldn't be a bad thing. But that kind of interior, and that's the simplicity of the design and the kind of intelligence of the interior design is really quite attractive, and it works really well in the context. So in Clove Street, it kind of fits, and that is obviously gives us a huge advantage. So although the building doesn't attract people because outside it looks the same, once people are inside, it kind of like, wow, okay, this isn't like a fly-by-night thing. This is something. And I know putting money into the exterior stuff doesn't always mean something spiritual is happening, but it actually does mean something when you've got permanent buildings. And I think in city centres it's really important. It'd be great to get some of these beautiful old church buildings. We need to pray into that as well. So all of that kind of expresses that we're serious contributors to the life of the city. After 2.5 years, we're now just under 300 people on Sundays. We have crossed the 300 a few times this year already. Got no students, which was a little bit of a surprise. Only postgrads, many 20-somethings, many 30-somethings who are single, and a significant number of families. The research suggested that wouldn't be the case, and it also, the experience of others was that when couples find each other and get married, they move out to the suburbs. We have experienced that. The difference, and again this is just an unfair freebie, is that even though these couples have now got their first child and moved out to the suburbs, they still want to be part of this congregation. There's a sense, and which we give thanks for, that God is doing something in the city, and people still want to be part of it. So we've had to start life groups that meet, in Claremont, that are entirely made up of people who attend the city congregation on a Sunday. So there's a kind of sense of we're in this together, and this is exciting, and the momentum is here. We've also got several kind of 50-somethings, people like me, and those guys are have lived the driven life, some of them very successful, and that blend provides a kind of intergenerational stability into the thing as well, which is great. I just want to make that distinction between missional and evangelistic before we get into the nuts and bolts of things that we've done, because it's a very important distinction. Mission is the advance of the kingdom of God into every area of life. It means engaging in and influencing the life of our towns at every level, spiritually, socially, culturally. It's works amongst the poor. It's connecting with the political struggles and people's responses to the political struggles in a town. It's connecting with the arts. It's a broad kind of, and the idea is the mission is to bring the kingdom of God socially, spiritually, culturally. I think that's Keller who uses those three phrases, which I think is really helpful. That is, evangelism is, if you like, well, evangelism is directly telling people about Jesus Christ. That's what evangelism is. Evangelism is communicating in some way, in print, in song, in word, who God is, who we are, what God has done by sending His Son as a perfect sacrifice for our sins, by dying on the cross, raised again from the dead, and you need to believe this, and you need to repent and put your trust in Him, and then you come into a whole new relationship with God and a new life, and that affects it. That's what evangelism is. So mission is, if you like, the umbrella under which everything else happens. You know, we are on a mission to bring the kingdom of God in numerous different ways. I mean, you could look at it from a more charismatic perspective. The kingdom is bringing the rule of God. It's bringing healing where there's sickness. It's bringing deliverance where there's bondage, and freedom where there's, you know, sight to the blind where there's, and so on. So you could look at it in so many different ways socially. The kingdom is bringing justice where there's been injustice. It's bringing freedom where there's been oppression. The kingdom of God is coming into every area of life. That's the mission. Evangelism is me saying to you, you need Jesus Christ. This is why you need Him. This is who He is. This is how you can get Him. That's evangelism. So evangelism is a part of mission. If you get that kind of confused, you can think you're more evangelistic than you are. Because actually what you're doing is you're engaging in lots of missional things, and you are connecting with the world, with those outside the life of the church, but you can think it's evangelism. It's not evangelism. It is just connecting with the world missionally, which we should be doing all the time. So it's important to make that distinction. Okay. So first of all then, I've got two parts to this, and this is all now ideas and things we've actually done. In fact, it's not really ideas, it's just things we've done. I put point one, and that's it. So this is just a barrage of things that we've done. I said on the pre-launch gathering to the city guys, we've got, and I've tried to keep it very, very simple. It's not complicated, it's simple. There are two goals of the city congregation. On the one hand, we want to be learning about the city. So that's different from preaching to the city. It's just learning about the city. Any good missional process needs to involve that. We're learning about the city. That means learning about the history of the city, learning about other people's experience of the city, which may be different to our experience of the city, and learning about that without getting defensive, without trying to correct it, or without becoming vengeful, or seeking to, overturn. It's just learning about the city. That's the first bit. I wasn't as verbose about it either. I just said, firstly, we want to learn about the city, learn about its history, learn different perspectives on that history without getting defensive. Secondly, we want to make a specifically Christian contribution to the city. And that primarily means great Sundays, and healthy life groups, midweek groups. And then there'll be a spattering of evangelistic stuff we also do. So it's very simple. Learning about the city and making a specifically Christian contribution to the city, which is Sundays and life groups. And I've said that many, many times. So in terms of learning about the city, what does that enable me to do? That enables me to do stuff without having to bolt on an evangelistic bit onto it, or bolt on some kind of spiritual, or bolt on some kind of decision or conclusion or action point. It's literally just learning. And I think learning about the place you're in is absolutely critical. No missionary would go to a foreign country. Say you were going, I don't know, to Devon. You said, God's called me to go to Devon in the, what is it, the southwest of England. You would never go to Devon without learning about the place. Learning kind of how things work there that's different from the other places in England. You wouldn't just say, oh, in London they believe this, therefore in Devon they also believe, there's nuance, so you'd want to learn about it. It also enables us to engage on things without having to get preachy, or without having to kind of put a stamp on it, or close it out in that kind of way. So that's largely been expressed through showing documentary films, through interviews, and through what we've called Cliff Street Conversations. I'll come back to Cliff Street Conversations. I'll come back to Cliff Street Conversations. So that's on the learning about the city side. We can put on church-based events where we literally just hear, okay, what's the perspective on this? We're not endorsing, we're just learning from people. There may be different points of view, and that's why interviewing them after a presentation is really helpful, because you can clarify things and so on. And then the specifically Christian contributions, as I said, it's Great Sundays. I hope I'm using the word great as a kind of goal rather than a statement of fact, but Great Sundays, healthy life groups. Our Sunday meetings go really 10:30 to 12 noon. That's because being multi-site, the first meeting begins here at 9:30, so we start at 10:30. I thought that might be a disadvantage because it's so late, and in England that wouldn't be such a bad time to start. But in South Africa, that's actually quite a late time to start, but it is working for us wonderfully in a number of different ways. What's different? I don't know your situation, so what's different? Well, the area itself, as I said, is neat, it's clean, it's open, it's modern. We employ a barista every Sunday. He makes coffee for all the servers. Everyone serving on the Sunday gets. They could have two if they want. They get free barista coffee. We use bean beans, and we've negotiated a relatively good deal with bean there on a wholesale price. The band get there at 8:30, which I know is a late start for those of you. It's like 8:30 to get there, great. Life group on welcome are there from about 10. City team members and congregational team members are there from 9:30, so an hour before. Although I've never really made that a law, and sometimes we're a bit late. Sometimes the kids are missing. The younger couples get there a bit late. That's fine. After the service, there's free barista bean there coffee for everybody. We don't charge for coffee, as well as free percolator coffee, which has also been there. If people don't want to wait in the queue to get a decent coffee, and people hang around, and as well tea and whatever. So people hang around for at least an hour after the service. One of the things I noticed when we went in and preached while it was still a Baptist church is the moment it ended, everyone was gone. And it was a really kind of strange thing. And I must admit, when we were here also, when the service was ended, I'm pretty much ready to go. But being a smaller context, of the kind of 280, 300 type size, it's just fantastic. People are meeting each other. I've spoken into that as well. I've left these out of my notes, but I've spoken into the fact that Cape Town's got a reputation for being a kind of insular, unfriendly place. When people come to Cape Town, they feel like they can't break into these circles of friendships. So I've said, so we are here, an expression of the kingdom of God. This is mission. Expression of the kingdom of God. We're smashing that to bits. So we've developed tons of kind of friendship-making moments. But one of them is what happens after Sunday. So I will almost every Sunday, not every Sunday because it becomes a bit formulaic, but I will almost always say, okay, the service is over, but church hasn't ended. So grab a cup of coffee, and you're allowed to go up to someone that you've never met before and just say, hey, hi, how long have you been coming? Deliberately trying to break into the cliques, and everything. So we do Sunday interviews. What I realized early on was that if we're waiting for a preacher, or if I'm preaching and I'm coming over, there's a potential danger gap where the band finished their set, let's say, and there's a gap. And so I wanted to kind of use that gap redemptively, and it worked so well that actually this is something that we want to do now all the time. So it doesn't matter if the preacher's late or not. And that is by doing these interviews. So one of the first one was it's just easy. At first it was just getting to know each other. Who's in the congregation? Who are some of the life group leaders? What's your story? And that really kind of helped gel people together, introduce folk. Lots of different voices are being heard from the front. Chemistry teacher from St. Sips, okay, how did you get into that? Is there a tension between your faith and the kind of expectation you're a science teacher and all of that? Patiswa, who's a jazz singer, she's now up in Joburg, but she showed us a little clip from her on TV and talked about how she became a singer and what kind of concerts she's doing, and then we got a backing track. We had all planned this obviously in advance, and then she actually performed a song. It's just very, very cool. Kika, who's our architect on the building, we interviewed her. Francis and Rosa, a Ghanaian couple, brilliant couple. They were headhunted by Amazon and moved down from Ghana to Cape Town, and he's in their cloud computing section, and they're now life group leaders at the city, and interviewing them, just the story of their conversions, which was very powerful from a Catholic background, to their journey in terms of university and then getting into Amazon, and then actually being moved down by the company. I mean, it's a great story. It's like, wow, these are great people. Ken Walton, who runs Truth Coffee, I became friends with him. He's now in our congregation, and we did an interview with him about hospitality. I love watching these programs about hotel managers who are experts in hospitality, the experience of the guest, from booking to arriving to the welcome that they receive when they first arrive at the hotel, to the quality of the experience all the way through. I love all that stuff. We're not running a hotel, but it's not a bad thing for pastors to try and see what's it like for a guest. We touched on some of that stuff. There's a link to that interview. That was such a good one, we put that online. Samir Diokula, who spoke, I interviewed him last Sunday, is an Indian guy, born again powerfully from a Hindu background, planted 4 churches, oversees numerous churches, and again, I'm deliberately introducing our congregation to guys who are functioning and serving around the world. Jubilee is a New Frontiers church that's part of Advance, so we kind of got this we've got 2 wings going on our plane. So he's a New Frontiers pastor. He's a significant church planter. He's a person of colour. I'm looking up to him. He's teaching us principles through his life story in the interview. All of that is good stuff that helps unite the congregation as well as glorify Christ. And things like, when we're coming up to do another women's Bible study. It's actually starting this morning. So Joe, my wife, did an interview with 2 of the women who did the first Bible study and who really loved it. And then we promoted the second one that's coming. We did that 2 weeks ago, and we've doubled the number of people who are attending it. So just kind of think like that. So if you've got an exploring membership coming up, your joining process, you know, you welcome folk in on the one Sunday, and then on that Sunday you've got the slide prepared for the next one that's coming, you know, in a month's time or whatever it is. It's a safe, you know, you're just thinking through the process. You're stepping back and looking at the whole kind of timetabled process like that. Multiplying life groups. So we've started 11 life groups since we started in October 2016, and this last one we did last Sunday is a plant. We've never done we've done a life group plant into Durbanville, but this is our kind of second, but a little bit more intentional life group plant into Hout Bay. We've got people coming from Hout Bay, and two of them are like, oh, no, there's no life group, it's so far, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, well, would you like to start one? Shall we begin praying into that? And as we prayed into it on our Wednesday prayer time, we just felt, let's just plant it in faith. So I made this declaration that we are currently praying to plant a life group into Hout Bay. Pray with us. Since that time, one person, it was their first Sunday they were visiting from Hout Bay, one family. And when she said to me afterwards, when I heard that, I thought, I can't believe it. We've just come, and there it was, that there's something, you know, starting in Hout Bay. So it's been kind of fun. So whenever we start a new life group or multiply, normally it would be a multiplication of a life group. We get everyone at the front who's going to be part of the new one. We introduce the leaders to the congregation. We pray for them. Growth is happening. Friendships are being made. The isolation is being broken down between people, and you're into another area. You know, and you sense the kind of momentum, which is absolutely great. The goal this year is to multiply 4, or to start 4 new life groups, which may be a little bit modest. I might not be saying that by the end of the year. We've done 2 already, and so I would love really secretly to crack 5, or maybe even 6. Better to overshoot the goal than to have a very ambitious sounding goal and not meet it. 10 to truth. What we did, is this in the first or the second year? Again, to try and raise the evangelistic temperature in the context, I had this idea of taking 10 objections, which you've got 10 minutes to answer over 10 Sundays, in that 10-minute slot before the preacher. And sometimes we do that, and then the notices, and then the preacher so it's not just, you know, 10 minutes of apologetics and then a 40-minute preach. They went really well. So there was, you know, is there any evidence for the existence of God? Isn't the Bible full of contradictions? Hasn't it changed over the years? What about suffering? Isn't Christianity a white man's religion? You know, all the major questions that science and faith, and I got a chemistry lecturer from UCT to come and do that. You know, it's just all the main kind of issues that people are asking now. We answered, and they're all on YouTube. I think it would probably be tough to wade through them all if you're just sitting in your computer, but it was kind of dynamic at the time. It felt really like, wow. And we did have people, I mean, there's one guy who said to me, I saw the first one on YouTube, and I just thought, right, he's not a churchgoer. I'm going to, and he's not born again, I'm going to attend this church for that series. He said, I've been to churches before, and I've heard sermons, and you know, God loves me and everything, but these are the issues that actually bug me about whether I can believe any of it. Not just the delivery in the moment that God loves you, but and we'll talk about some of these issues in the second bit. But these are the issues. You know, can I trust the Bible? Why the blood? Why the sack? Why the pride? You know, these are some of the issues. So that was quite exciting to do, and you've got a link in your notes to that as well. We've also done things like picnics in the gardens. Again, this is so not fair, but we are just literally a road away from the strangely named company's garden. I can't believe they have changed that name, but anyway, we're just there. So people and we've got a spa, and the spa in Cliff Street is a spa on hipster steroids. you know, a Spar or a 7-Eleven, it's just a nip in, nip out. This one has got a full kind of 3-bay Italian coffee machine. It's just classic Clove Street. So they do these phenomenal lunches, salads, and a whole range of different lunches that cater to the crowd midweek. So our guys, they can either bring stuff or they go across, they buy stuff, and then they go across to the gardens for picnics. We've done quite a few of those. And one guy said to me, he came to church, first time, he heard obviously there was a picnic happening, he went on the picnic, and he said, and after 2.5 hours, 3 hours, I've suddenly, with those I've got friends. And he's joined us, and he's still with us to this day. And I think that was the first picnic we did. So it's just, again, it's a way of connecting people. We mustn't make the mistake of thinking if our systems are right, if our follow-up systems are right, if our databases are right, even if our Instagram is, it's people meeting people. And I've said to our guys so many times, honestly, it's not that I don't care, I do care, but only a bit. I don't really care if you don't get their details and their details aren't entered into the database. What's much, much more important, 90%, 10%, is that they make a connection with you. They actually feel like they've met someone who they could trust and that this could become a friendship. Honestly, that is worth more than, no, you've got to fill out the form. No, the goal is fill the form out. Forget the form. Who cares about the form? That can come later. You know, and also, does that really all need to be done up front? When people enter the experience on their first Sunday, they fill out. If you went into a cafe and before you ordered, they asked you to put your credit card details into the machine or to volunteer some data of yours, you would never do it. So let's get it the right way around. This is about encountering each other, finding each other, and finding God. That's the really important thing. The administration is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but don't put the cart before the horse, to use an old Victorian metaphor. Don't get it the wrong way around. The administration follows. Just in the same way as the correctives and the kind of shaping that Paul does in the epistles follows the actual growth, the gathering of people. It's that way around. It's not the other way around. Paul is writing into situations where something's happened and people have gathered, and then he begins to try and iron out what we actually believe and how we actually express these and how we're actually living. It kind of follows. Now there's more of a mingling on that, but it's just important to get it right. Anyway, so picnics. And then we've done a couple of concerts in the park as well where we just attend. So we don't have to be running everything. You know, there are things that the city, I mean, again, we're in the city, so you may be in, I don't know, somewhere else, you may be, I don't know where you are. There may not be these events that are happening around you. So again, it's an unfair advantage, but the city runs these events. You know, Freshly Ground played last Sunday in the ballpark. A bunch of our people will just go, and instead of a picnic, that's what happens, after church. And it's not a whole church thing, we're not up there preaching the gospel, it's a connection. This is mine now. We also run a free library. We don't have a bookstore. I put one of my own bookshelves in there, and I've just filled it with good books. And you have it, it's yours, take it. You don't need to pay for it. I just put a thing on there which says something like, take one and bring one next time, or bring one and take one next time. Something like that, some phrase that the idea is you take one and you bring one, but it's yours after that. But of course every single one's got, you're invited to Jubilee, 10:30 Close Street, stamped into the front page. And then the service is finished, but church isn't over. Good Christmas Day is a good one. Slightly different evangelistic moment. That's not really a reaping moment. It's more, this is family members who ordinarily perhaps wouldn't come to church, so they're not there because they're spiritually hungry, which is more what you would expect on an ordinary Sunday, where you could reap, therefore. this is more, so you just manage it slightly different. Same with Good Friday and Easter Sunday. They are definitely evangelistic opportunities, but by and large, you're speaking to people who are there for a secondary reason, not because they've suddenly said, I've got to get to church, I've got to get some kind of spiritual direction in my life. But you don't miss that opportunity, but those have always been big moments for us. Non-Sunday stuff, as I mentioned, building friendships. So we've now got this little group, I don't know if I can call them a committee, I don't know what we should call them, but who propose kind of social events, things to do. So the first one was, let's do a board games event. I'm thinking, what? I didn't say that, I was thinking that. I would never go to that. But you know what? It's actually becoming increasingly popular. I happened to be in Asheville, in North Carolina, and was walking along with a friend, and there's a whole cafe devoted to board games. It was closed at the time, so on the thing it just said game over, which I thought was quite nice. And the whole theme is all around games, and it's a thing, you know. And I just saw it in America. It wasn't my idea, but that kind of resonated with me after the event. So he says, "Yeah, we'll do a board game event. It'll be fantastic. It'll be wonderful. We get lots of board games." No. I said, "Okay, well, when? When's the kind of key time?" He said, "Well, straight after church." Again, I thought, what? Straight after church? Who's going to come to that? We've just been to church. And again, I'm learning as I go. It was a huge success. Well, huge in terms of my expectations for it. I thought there'd be two people, the organizer and a reluctant friend. You know, yeah, exactly.
And his wife.
So, yeah. But what I learned was a key thing. Single folks don't necessarily have a plan for the rest of the day. How did I not know that? How did I not know that? So it's us with the families who are like, what? No, we've got to get the kids back. You know, they're going to be like crawling up the walls by then, or we've got this person for lunch, and we're hosting, you know, whatever it is. But fantastic. Then they did a Friday night, went well. Now we've got another one coming as well. So these things, and they are friendship builders. You're breaking down barriers. You're enabling people to connect. As I've mentioned, the women's Bible studies had the same effect, and it's double the size now. They've got 24 this time. Breakfasts before church have been another thing that the guys have done. So again, I would just never do this. And I think if you've got kids, you're probably not going to do this. We go out to the farmers market somewhere. Is it in Greenpoint or wherever it is, and we have breakfast, and then we go to church. That's like two major, you know, assault course options for parents with young kids who never do it. But because of our demographic, because of the numbers of young 20s and 30s that we've got, these things are working. We also did, I think it's 2017, we did a week of events called Seeking. So the idea was seeing and seeking. So again, it's like seeing what's happening in the city and seeking God in the midst of the city. So we just put the K into brackets. And there were 4 evening events. An Impossible Return, which is a documentary film that hadn't been screened at the time. And I, through a church member, had made contact with the filmmaker, Sheena O'Connell. And Impossible Return is about the forced removals of people of colour from Constantia, from Claremont, Mowbray, from the southern suburbs. And it's shocking because you don't realise that happened. And it was like, and then in the documentary they've got people returning to the homes that they grew up in, and 2 brothers go back to the home that they built, which they were forced out of. And it is an incredibly powerful film. And then I did an interview with the filmmaker, you know, about kind of what was the process and so on. And then what we did is, rather than open Q&A, we had 120 people at both. We've shown that twice now. We've had 120 people at both ones. We we got them into round tables to just, because people need to express their response to that. So that was a really valuable learning about the city thing. It's sensitizing people to the reality of the missional context that we're in. And I think that's incredibly important. And even though for some that might be like, wow, I never heard that, people really feel like, now I'm learning about the story. I'm actually learning the real story. And that's very important if you're on a mission to transform, if you're on a mission to renew Cape Town through the gospel. We also did an art exhibition and a literary event, which was a massive undertaking where we didn't just go, it wasn't an open invitation for submissions. It was, in terms of the artworks, it was by invitation only. And so I've just because of my own interest in this stuff, I have personal friends who are artists who exhibit in galleries in different parts of the country, and who very generously even sent down, I mean, one guy sent down 2 pieces, which is amazing. And they were on sale as well, so it was kind of a, and I think we waived any kind of fee from our side if you sold it, and good for you. But there are a couple of people in the church our size who are at that level, although even those pieces needed to be carefully curated. So there's a real sense anyway, great turnout, real sense of wow, it wasn't like one of those Christian things you've been to, where it's good-hearted and you feel like decisions have been made based on the pastoral encouragement that the person would feel, rather than it really being a reflection of the quality that you're looking for. So there's a little bit of a Simon Cowell element to curating something like that. You just need to do it carefully. And then it was followed by a sequence of read poems by poets who are in print, and I only included published poets, which again is not really very fair, but I think for the first event anyway, again, for some people the idea of sitting and listening to someone reading poetry is just death. So you have to create an entertaining moment. So it's different readings, different poets, different styles, and then we threw in a couple of performance poets as well, spoken word poets, who are absolutely fantastic. I mean, they ripped the thing apart, which is absolutely great. So again, some of that was evangelistic, not the paintings, but some of the spoken word poetry particularly was directly evangelistic. And it's difficult, when your hair's being blown back by the force of the skill of the wordplay. People don't mind if you're being exalted to turn to God. But most of the poets are not Christian and are part of a writers group that I've been part of for several years now, probably 4 years now in Cape Town. And then the next night we got 3 or 4 Christian politicians who we believe are born again to talk about, as a kind of panel discussion, what was the impulse for you to get into politics? And one of my hopes for this, I don't think it happened, was that there would be some Christians in the audience who would say, actually, I need to, maybe this is a call, maybe this is like what's the word, vocational call for me. I'm not aware that happened yet, but it was very interesting having Christians from different parties, from the Christian party, the DA, the EFF, I don't think the ANC came, talking about their journey as believers into that arena to try and influence in different spheres of the political spectrum. That's very interesting. And then we did a close street conversation with Richard Borgenheim, who's someone I'm friends with. He's at Lloyd's of London. He's a guy who does these kind of talks, inspirational and spiritual, evangelistic, but carefully done talks to CEOs and boards at companies around Europe and in America particularly. he was over for a trip, so he very kindly offered to do one. And the Close Street Conversation idea, that was a Friday night, but all the others have been either Wednesday lunchtimes or Fridays. The idea of a Close Street Conversation was to try and maximize the geographical space that we're in. So we're not just calling it a Christian conversation, it's a Close Street conversation. These are conversations happening in the city. And have been on a variety. The first one was with Zahira Asmal, who's not a believer in Christ, who is an author and a publisher whose primary interest is about creating inclusive city spaces. So how architecture and city planning affect the experience of people who live in the city. I mean, absolutely, couldn't get a more relevant topic. It's very well attended. It's brilliant. Makhatsi Mashur from, I think he's a Common Ground now, isn't he? Who is an RZIM speaker and director of RZIM in Africa. Spoke again on God and race, I think we gave him. John Lawson, the gangster. This is a London boy. And I don't know how I got in touch with him anyway. He came down and he was a gangster. He's a villain. Proper hard villain, proper hard villain, who his gang, after another gang had robbed a load of people, they would rob their gang. So he was a gangster of gangsters. And that's what he was. And he told us those hair-raising stories of, he didn't go into too much detail, of blood-curdling violence and getting locked up in, banged away in prison, and the turnaround in his life when he discovered Christ. I can't remember if it was Alpha or not, but he got thoroughly born again, and he now goes around preaching the gospel. That was a brilliant one. And then we did Love and the Bulldozer, which was another documentary. Again, that one was very evangelistic, full on, go for the response, got a response, yeah, fantastic. Love and the Bulldozer was a documentary about the church's response to District 6. And how the churches in District 6 responded pastorally to the absolute chaos and destruction that followed the result of District 6 being declared a whites-only area. And that is an absolutely brilliant thing. And to get access to it, I went down to the museum and just connected so well with the archivist there, that by the end of our conversation, he just said, look, you can have access to everything we've got. We've tended to hold on to it and not publicize it, but we're now realizing we need to use this to educate people. So if you want to come down and look at the various videos and footage and stuff that we've got, you can come and do it. And obviously that's a massively time-consuming thing. But anyway, that was really, and I did an interview again with Mandy Sanger, who's the head of education at District 6 Museum. She was excellent and had to go at the English, which is probably what we deserve. And we also had Max Janaghathan, who's a Sri Lankan business guru, who spoke about integrity, honesty in business, and that was, again, a well-attended one. That's Close Street Conversations. Word 1-to-1. What's the time? 20. When am I supposed to finish, Dave? I didn't put a timer on.
It's your call, so.
Okay, well let me just quickly, I'm nearly there. Word 1-to-1. So we use a couple of resources, which I think I've forgotten to put into the resources. Anyway, the first is Take a Closer Look at Christ, at the Claims of Christ, which is a study I wrote years ago that you could do one-on-one with a non-Christian. 4 sessions if you're in a rush, or you could cut them into 8 if you've got a bit more time. Normally they work better over 8 lunchtime sessions. And we've seen many, many people become Christians over the years and in different churches through that resource. Unfortunately, at the moment, the only digital version is on Amazon, but it's only like 99 cents US dollars to put it up. Maybe I just should make it free on there. And literally, it's not a money-making thing at all. But the reason it's there is that you could access it, and your non-Christian friend could access it on the same day, and you could start the study. That's why I put it onto the Kindle version of Amazon. Take a closer look at the claims of Christ. The other one is a study for new believers, and I've just put this up online as a PDF, which you can download for free, and the bit.ly URL is there under the resources heading as well. Richard Borgenon was converted through reading the Gospel of John, as was I. So we automatically had a kind of sense of camaraderie. He has developed it's a very long study, but it's a study through John where you just go verse by verse, and it's less confrontational than mine in the sense that you're not asking a question and they have to answer it. Although the question you ask, you can take a closer look, is what's the missing word in that verse? Oh, repent. What does that mean? You know, it's that kind of thing. This is much more like, this is what it means here, this is what it means here. You literally go verse by verse. So it's a very long process. So one of the guys that came in at around the Tend to Truth period that we were doing was a guy called Sunil, become a good friend of ours, as a member of the church now. And he's told his story publicly, so he doesn't mind me telling it. He is a successful trader living in the city. He's got a 2 or 3 story house right on the mountain, beautiful setting. But as so often is the case, as you know, with wealthy, successful people, after a while, it's not enough. And he really got to a point where he just wanted to end it all. So one Saturday he decided, I'm going to kill myself. So he's got this massive dog. So he gets the dog's lead and he ties it up on the bottom part of the banister going up the stairs. And he just pulls on it and thought, it's too weak, it's just going to snap. So I need to get something, but the shops are shut. And he says, I'll get some proper rope from a hardware store and I'll get that on Monday. And the figures are that when men decide to commit suicide, generally they do it. So he'd made this decision, now what to do, Saturday night, Sunday. So he phoned a friend of his, Kerry. Now Kerry had just started coming along to our congregation. And he said to her, listen, tomorrow, do you want to take the dogs for a walk, tomorrow morning? I've got nothing to do. Kerry said this, and I love her for it. She said, no, I go to church on Sunday. I just thought, how many Christians would say, non-Christians interested in, walking dogs, talking. I won't go to church. I'll do something missional, But she had kept her discipline. She said, no, Sunday morning I go to church. Which is something, by the way, that we encourage our people to do, is to go to church on Sunday. I know it's fallen out of style, but that's one thing we insist on. Anyway, or we urge, or we exhort, or we So I just thought, wow, amazing. So he said, oh, fine, put the phone down. About half an hour later, he phoned back and said, do you think I could come with you? She said, sure, okay. So the Sunday morning, he comes along, he's with Kerry, and I happen to be preaching on the reliability of the Bible as part of a series, I think on, foundations or something. I can't remember what the series was, but this one was, getting to grips with the Bible, something like that. And I went through some of the objections to the Bible first, because this double-edged thing that we talk about actually means talking to the non-believer rather than assuming the non-believer in your sermon. It's actually directly, for me anyway. So, what are the objections? These are the objections. It's been changed over time. Those contradictions. Anyway, he went, wow, that was relevant, because that's what I believe about it. I think it is full of all that stuff, and suddenly I'm in church and they're saying it. So he made a beeline for me. He's quite an upfront guy after the service, and we had a conversation, and we just hit it off. So I said to him, I tell you what, on Tuesday morning, remember he's going to die on Monday, on Tuesday morning, why don't we get together? I've got this new study, this word one-to-one Richard Borgenon thing. It just goes through the Gospel of John. You get a copy, I get a copy, there's no mystery, it's not going to make you feel like you don't know. You've got everything that I've got. We're over the table together, both of us, with the same material, just like you do in a business meeting. And he said, done, fine. And And then that was, I think, in February. Almost every single Tuesday we met for an hour from 10 to 11 going through this material. And in the September, so 7 months later, gives his life to Christ. He's now baptized in the church. And it's just an amazing thing. He was about to kill himself. His one Christian friend said, "That's church day." So he said, "Okay, that's church day, can I come?" He then hears a relevant message. He then gets personal, if you like, discipling type evangelism style. It's not the only way. I didn't get that. I just read the gospel myself. But not everyone gets that. Some people do alpha. Some people just, come, bang, it happens in the moment. And he's through. Other ideas that we've done when we were at OBS, which we haven't yet done in the city, things like marriage course, big screen debates, quiz nights. We've done a community carnival around here for Salt River kids and families, dinner and dances. The real growth mechanism for us is life group attendance and exploring membership. That's where we register the growth. That's where it happens, apart from just the attendance. Okay, ton of stuff. All the resources are there. Some of them are videos. I think the first one is one that I did for a church in the US, but it still goes through the different leaflets that we use and personal tracks and all that. And the other stuff's there. Okay, any questions?
Done them all. That's great.
Interview sessions.
Oh yeah.
That
In the
sometimes it's separate events, like I've heard, but is it sometimes we do it inside the Sunday meeting?
Yes, always. Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously we do interviews in other contexts, like if we've just shown a video or a documentary, I'll then interview the documentary maker. So that's. But on Sundays, there's usually there's a spot. So the other thing I've done is I've done little nugget bits of teaching about our values, because one of the weaknesses of multi-site, of course, is that you don't necessarily, when you plant something fresh, you would at least in the first year, you'd be pumping in the values of what kind of church you are and what you believe and why you believe it and where it is in the Bible. When you do multi-site, the preaching schedule and the series are kind of set up. So that's a weakness. So there are lots of advantages, but it's also a weakness. So I've sometimes used that little 10-minute bit to speak into why life groups, why baptism in water, why church membership, why friendships. I've done lots of them. In fact, I'm compiling them together to make a good little booklet of just why do you do that, why do you do that, why do you do that, why do you do that. So teaching the values, why the Bible and reading the Bible. Why is Bible reading important? All of these kind of things come in. So those interviews, along with, so there's that, the little teaching bits. There's interviews, which is both getting to know people in the life of the church and introducing people, whether it's advanced folk or New Frontiers folk or someone just with a great conversion story, or Vimpy Moster, who was dramatically, miraculously healed of multiple injuries in a second. Those kind of verifiable stories. Excellent to do an interview like that. Just boosts everyone's faith. So when I'm talking about those 10-minute interviews, that's in the service itself. Worship, interview, welcome, preach, or it could be worship, welcome, interview, then preach. If it's a teaching nugget, okay, we've got baptisms coming up. Why baptize in water? Why not baptize infants? It would be worship, teaching nugget, I suppose. Welcome, which is a different voice and it slides up, and then the preach. So you just vary it a little bit. I also alternate the length of worship depending on the giftedness of the worship leader. So we don't say we have X number of time worship and that's fixed. No, depending on who's leading and how good they are, the goal is to get a good experience for everyone. So that might mean if that person led for a longer time, can feel they're not quite there yet. So rather than put them through that, I mean, the person leading, rather make this a good thing, shorten it slightly, that kind of thing. It's like the application of common sense on most of these things.
Let's just a comment on, a number of these things that you're doing obviously speaks into the missional aspect of church life. How do you engage with culture, particularly transgender, homosexuality? Do you speak into it?
So I think all these things are engaging with culture. So I don't think culture is defined by a couple of issues. I don't think that's what you're saying, though. No. But so yeah, sometimes it's better to do stuff like we've done just now, which is an outside speaker coming in and a whole church event. So we did an event with you guys on Wednesday evening with Andrew Wilson on sexuality and scripture. And I think, although these comments do come up almost every time in exploring membership, so we don't shy away from it, we teach into it. And we certainly respond if people have got questions about gender issues or leadership, structure, or some of the more ethical, moral, sexual issues that come up. Something like the Wednesday that we've just had, I think really helps, because it's an outside person teaching very clearly and very giftedly, and as someone who's had to battle through some of these things themselves. And I think sometimes we can come, if you're not careful, because of limited time, you feel like you need to get to the conclusion before you've given the reasons for the conclusion, and that can come across as just being dismissive. So I think all of these things you need to handle carefully. But that one issue, the issue of homosexuality or transgenderism, hasn't yet significantly surfaced for us at the city.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought maybe being in the city would be more prevalent.
Is this what suburbs people think of the city?
We've probably got it more than you did in
I don't mean to. I'm not casting an aspersion by saying that. I'm just saying, look, we can think things are a certain way. I'm responding to what is, and if issues come up, then I want to respond to them. But I'm not going to presume and then roll out something that can create, I don't know.
No, totally. My thought would be that there would be, so that's why I asked the question.
Yeah. I think, a gay person is pretty well aware of the church's position on these things. I mean, we have had, when we did Alphas here, we have had gay couples coming on, and we're the ones who are kind of like, what do we do? And I realized after a little while that actually of course, this person has been processing this intelligently for far, far more longer than I have. So I want to try and avoid just being presumptuous. Sorry, do you have a question?
Yes. The people you invite to the interviews, how do you manage that? First of all, you get people that's like high up there, guys from Lloyd's in London, and then just the lecturer or the women at the museum. But how do you just trust Holy Spirit that you're the next person?
How do I make those connections?
Yeah.
I'm just involved in loads of stuff that isn't just church stuff. Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I am, I met Zahira Asmal at the Cape Town Book Festival, a few years ago. I go to things because I don't mean that in an arrogant, I am personally interested in book festivals, and I'm also conscious that that's where ideas are not just being formed, that's where ideas are actually getting published and promoted. So it's a good place to be, to hear some of those discussions, meet some of those authors, And when I go, I went to the one last year, I only went to the once. The problem is, our diaries are packed, you know? So when I went to that first one, I had to actually not go to some things, and I felt a sense of, you know, why weren't you there? But you've got to, you know, you do need to make a decision sometimes and communicate as well, of course. You know, you need to get involved, you know, in whatever. So I do go, I mean, I will go to the theatre as regularly as I can. It's not in the, I haven't got a budget for it, but I do want to know what's going on in the arts. I do want to know, like, some of these issues. I want to be engaging with the culture of the place that I'm trying to reach. If all I'm doing is I'm on my own and I'm listening to a podcast by Tim Keller, you know, no, I love Tim Keller, but I'm going to get a skewed view of the world I'm living in. I'm going to think that's the normal, and that isn't the normal. We're in the situation that we're in now, so yeah, sure, you know, Piper has a good insight onto the meaning of this word in this verse, but I need to actually build bridges as much as I can, missionally, because I'm in this place, you know. I mean, Andrew Wilson on Sunday at Jubilee, this last Sunday, did, I think, a fantastic job, a great example of an outsider doing his homework and then speaking into a situation. So you get the objectivity of the outsider, but you get the research as well. So he spent the first 15 or so minutes of his talk talking about the foundations of Christianity, how the first major influences of the church fathers were African, Augustine and Origen and all those, Tertullian. The second tier were Asian, and then you have to zoom considerably forward up to the Reformation before you get to Luther and Calvin, the more European influence. So just putting that historical grid up of who we actually are and where we've actually come from is really, really helpful. So for me, I want to keep connecting in small ways, in big ways, however I can. I go to book launches, I meet people, you know, and then I discover, this guy's an author, he did this. You know, I went to one guy's talk, it was absolutely fantastic, and he didn't respond. There wasn't that sense of personal connection, and when I emailed him, he just didn't even answer about whether he would do one of these Cliff Street conversations. So, you know, that's fine. But if you're not there, you're not going to meet people. So you do need to, like in my writers group, I mean, all of them are published poets and authors. So I'm in a little, they're not the only, you know, group of published writers in Cape Town by any means, but at least I'm there. I'm in that group, I'm making a contribution to that group, and they're making a contribution to me. You know, we need to get kind of involved in stuff.
The question I will ask is, obviously you're writing guides, you're opening up quite a bit of interest, so people will so what I'm liking, what I'm saying is you're opening up people to experience certain things, but out of that there's questions going to be raised. Obviously you're addressing those questions through some of your nuggets, teaching moments, but how do you balance this good appetite for your congregation and addressing issues that comes up through conversations, through culture?
Yeah.
How do you balance that? Because you are felt led to give a solid appetite for your people, through working through books and what God is leading you, but also engaging in teaching into that issue that arises.
So yeah, by creating a kind of two-tiered objective, learning about the city, making a specifically Christian contribution to the city, I am not weighed down with having to actually address or answer all the issues that learning about the city raises. In actual fact, it may just be helpful to hear without needing to feel that you have to speak into it. So that, and again, even just saying that immediately wins people, because I think there's an expectation that you you've got to give your correction or perspective, or, and I know that's not what you mean teaching into it, but actually, I just feel like we're not, also the other thing I didn't say is I don't rubbish the past in terms of the history of our congregation. Our congregation was planted in 1876 by a guy called William Hamilton, who was sent to Cape Town by C.A. Spurgeon. So the Jubilee story is joining an older story. Now that older story is primarily a white story. I mean, I've read through it, there's hardly any literature on it anyway, but I've gone to the archives, the National Archives, and I've searched online, I've done everything that I can possibly do. I've written to Spurgeon's College to find if they can send me copies of letters that Spurgeon may have written to Hamilton. But my assumption is that the story of Cape Town Baptist Church is a story which also includes, or also excludes. So the Jubilee connection to that ongoing story means we now have an opportunity to correct some of that. We now have an opportunity to reshape and remodel and remake the story, to make it a better story. Now, in one sense, that is addressing that issue, but without anyone assuming that they're, certainly not from my perspective, an expert on that or has the only perspective. In fact, part of learning about the city is to hear different perspectives rather than insist on one narrative only. You know, there are different people's experiences of the things that have happened in our city, and a lot of it is truly horrible. So it's not just like raking up, or, you know, it's like, hold on, what's the mission field that we're in? You know, what do I need to learn so that I can more effectively make a Christian contribution into that? You know? So I'm not drawing, even now I have some thoughts, but I'm not drawing conclusions like up front, you know. And I think if you study missionaries who went to, say, China or wherever, a lot of it, I mean, Hudson Taylor, he's learning about the local culture. He's assimilating to the local culture. I mean, and he was criticized, I mean, savagely by other missionaries, and his funding was struggling from England because they saw him as someone who's pandering to the Chinese, pretending to be Chinese, having his head shaved with a ponytail at the back. He was ostracized by the missionaries who were in the missionary compound where he refused to live because he wanted to, you know, these are all kind of little clues for us about what happens when you're on mission. Now, if we're on mission, we have to learn about the context. I mean, it's just simple. So I think that does raise issues, but I don't feel like I've got to have an answer on any of that. I think it's more of a dialogue. What I have got an answer on is the specifically Christian, the stuff that I know I can stand on and declare, that I will stand on and declare. But even that is shaped in its tone by what I'm learning over here. Does that make sense? So, for example, we've got to finish up and do something else because you must be getting bored or tired by now. But, for example, you know, have you read, I mean, the basics, you know, Albert Latuli's Let My People Go. If you haven't, then why aren't you not on a mission? Are we not on a mission to the same place? Or Long Walk to Freedom, or Odyssey of Freedom by George Bezos, you know, or you can have a go at some Steve Biko. The trouble with Steve Biko, of course, he hasn't got a clue about the church. He only sees the church as a kind of community organisation, so he misfires, you know, quite a lot. But nevertheless, some of the core of what he's saying needs to be heard. You know, these are kind of fathers of the nation, if you like, and you don't have to agree with everything that you're reading, but are we accessing our nation's, you know, heroes? Are we learning from them? I mean, George Bezos is a brilliant one. This is a refugee. He came in as a refugee, you know, and didn't speak a word of English or Afrikaans, and struggled, turned around, and suddenly there he is, defending, on the right side of history, defending Mandela at the Rivonia trial, adjusting the speech so that he didn't get the death sentence, all of these things. You know, so there's lots of kind of core texts that I think we should be accessing, and that's not a plea that it's not a political statement. None of that's political, even though these guys were ultimately involved in politics. It's about learning about where we are and trying to hear it from different. Lutuli is particularly good because he writes absolutely from a Christian perspective, and so he talks about, you know, times in the presence of God, even when he was in prison, and how, although it was so unjust that he was in prison, and yet he encountered God in the darkest places. You know, I mean, it's full of, you know, when he goes to the World Council of Churches and he suddenly realizes, wow, this is a global thing. The gospel is, you know, it's India, it's Africa, it's Europe, it's South America, it's North. He gets this global vision. He also paints a Christian vision for the future South Africa that we've actually, to a degree, moved away from in ANC thinking. So he, as he was president of the ANC, he was saying to the PAC, don't leave now. Once we've got democracy, we can split into loads of different parties and become a democracy. That's the idea. But now we need to stay together. You know, so he's got a clear vision of a Christian-infused democratic process. So that I think is really, really helpful and really, really interesting. So, you know, I think doing some of that basic reading is also good. I'm just using those examples off the top of my head, but I do try and read more widely than just that core group, but that core group are significant still. Okay, can we break for, say, 10 minutes?